Today, I'm going to tell you about a civilization of amphibious cephalopoids. The homeworld of the cephalopoids was a blue planet flecked with spots of green and gray. The planet was somewhat smaller than Earth, and so it had lower gravity, so the waves were taller and moved more slowly, and some of the rock formations which jutted from the oceans took on unusual and precarious shapes, such as long arches and slender spires. The cephalopoids, like Earth cephalopods, evolved from a shelled mollusk which eventually gave up its shell for greater mobility. They had large brains, manipulative tentacles, and powerful eyes which could discriminate color. They reproduced by the thousands and hunted in great, swarming packs. They were omnivorous, eating various plants, fishes, and other mollusks. They even ate each other. They were opportunistic cannibals. Finally, they sometimes crawled onto land to eat protein-rich, land-dwelling insects. Later, when their civilization developed into the tribal phase, competition over the rare island feeding grounds would become quite common. In my opinion, the most important feature of these creatures is their ability to change colors. Originally, this adaptation was to avoid predators, but in time it developed into a system of communication, in which different colors and patterns conveyed different meanings. At first this was just used to coordinate pack hunting, but over time it began to be used in various social contexts. For most of their history, the only social structure of the species was the family swarm, a cooperative group of related cephalopoids which hunted together and occasionally attacked other family swarms for food. But with the development of language, a new social system emerged in which two or more family swarms formed a tribe which worked towards common goals. This was incredibly effective, and in time all cephalopoids either joined the tribes or were driven to extinction. This was simultaneously a time of great cultural development and of brutality. On one hand, the efficiency of the tribes gave the species more time for philosophical and artistic concerns. A crude ceramic technology was developed, and a form of color-changing dance was invented, which is roughly their artistic equivalent to music on Earth. But, on the other hand, because they were so powerful, the tribes frequently devoured family swarms which hadn't adopted the tribal lifestyle. The tribes also waged war on each other. I should mention briefly that, though the species was cannibalistic, they never kept each other as livestock, probably because it's very hard to keep someone permanently penned in when you're in the ocean. Probably for the same reason, the species never practiced slavery. Anyways, they eventually developed agriculture and the cultivation of livestock, though the livestock were all free range, since it's, hard to keep someone penned in underwater. But with the development of agriculture came one of the great crises of the species. As I've mentioned, they reproduced by the thousands. Now, normally, very few of these thousands would reach reproductive age, since most would starve or be killed off. But with the development of agriculture, a much larger proportion of these offspring could survive. This led to a population explosion, which in turn led to widespread famine, social unrest, and a lot more cannibalism. So, in many places, this led to a complete breakdown of the social structure. However, one of the tribes that didn't fall apart came up with a clever solution to their population problem. Before fertilization, most eggs in a clutch were to be destroyed, so that no one would have more than 2 or 4 children per clutch of eggs. This next part is definitely contrary to human sensibilities. Instead of just destroying the eggs, they ritualistically cooked and ate them. I should note that many insect races throughout the galaxy have come up with similar cultural solutions to the population problem. It should tell you a lot about how horrible the periods of famine and cannibalism were that this new cultural adaptation was quickly and eagerly adopted. Now began a period of cautious optimism. Tribal civilization was rebuilt, and soon developed into a nation-state culture, complete with cities and divisional labor. Permanent habitations were built on land, and because of the scarcity of the islands, these habitations quickly took on a religious significance, becoming sites for group activities, art, and science. They were especially important for astronomy, since one could look up at the stars without having one's vision distorted by the planet's ocean. In time, the species developed trade routes and even market economies. For a while, the species was technologically impoverished, specializing mostly in culture, art, and philosophy. However, soon after the development of permanent land habitations, they discovered how to harness fire. With this discovery, they were able to industrialize, smelting metals and developing all manner of mechanized wonders. Now, with the advent of industrialization, a new ideology emerged which was profoundly pro-cephalopoid. It emphasized reason, non-violence, and the natural rights of individual members of the species. Particularly, it rejected cannibalism as a cause of war and a severe debasement of the spirit. This ideology was adopted by several nations and eventually led to a series of world wars in which millions were slaughtered in the name of civility and nonviolence. The species never really got good at utilizing combustion, so most projectiles were powered by some kind of compressed gas. Their most powerful weapon was a large CO2-powered torpedo filled with a crude explosive. They used battleships and submarines, and they fought in great swarms. Handheld anti-personnel weapons were heavy and cumbersome, so hand-to-hand, or rather tentacle-to-tentacle combat was commonplace. The most common melee weapon was a razor-sharp barb coated in a potent neurotoxin. Trained animals were also used, such as an enormous shark-like predator, which was used to break formations, or a swarming insectile crab, which was used against fortified positions. As I've mentioned, the species was skilled with ceramics. After they industrialized, they developed a materials science far more nuanced than the materials science known on Earth. It is often said that craftsmanship doesn't really begin until you have at least 6 arms. Now, during the World Wars, this materials science would play a crucial part. It turned out that the island land habitations were of supreme strategic and tactical importance. They were heavily armed and fortified as the wars progressed. The frequent struggles to take and hold them were somewhat reminiscent of the horrors of trench warfare on 20th century Earth. Eventually, cephalopoid scientists came up with a solution to this, the construction of enormous protective shells which were to be placed over the island habitations. Now, this might seem impractical, but you gotta keep in mind that the cephalopoids originally developed from shelled molluscoids, so there was a certain appeal to the shell city solution. Also, these shells were practically indestructible. The proof of the matter is that it worked. Storming a shelled city proved impossible. After one side began to use these shells to encase their island cities, the other side tried to imitate them, but after decades of war, they didn't possess the industrial capacity or the ingenuity to imitate them effectively. So within a few years, most islands on the planet were encased, the final war was concluded, and cannibalism was, for the most part, abolished. Now began the great springtime of the species. It turns out that cannibalism was their chief motive for war. After it was abolished, wars became a thing of the past. Now, this might seem unbelievable if you're a human, but you have to keep in mind that these creatures were generally more disposed to collective and cooperative activities than humans are. This is probably because, for most of their evolutionary history, the basic social unit was the family swarm. So they were biologically hardwired for cooperative, altruistic, and mutually beneficial activity on a much larger numerical scale than the humans are. Now, I'm not going to get into the behavioral biology of it. It may even be simpler than this. My hypothesis is that most wars are over territory, and that since the cephalopoids were used to living in swarms, their territorial impulse was just weaker than that of humans. So, they dedicated their efforts to the improvement of art, culture, and technology. The island shell cities became self-sustaining laboratories, academies, and observatories. The cephalopoids developed many new technologies, including a lightweight material capable of withstanding intense radiation. This enabled them to establish a permanent colony on their planet's moon. Though the colony never became self-sufficient, it had to rely on regular trade with the home world. For some decades, the species continued to peacefully develop along these lines. But then came the greatest crisis of the species, a form of cultural cancer. The shell cities were unusual places, even before the discovery of the indestructible fortifying shells. For an organism which usually spent most of its time underwater, spending long periods of time on islands tended to foster an attitude of philosophical detachment. As new technologies permitted some cephalopoids to spend their entire lives in these cities, these detached attitudes became even more common. You can think of it as a sort of ivory tower ultra-urbanism, where the city dwellers began to think of themselves as superior and enlightened. They were, in some sense, more scientifically and theoretically educated than their ocean-dwelling counterparts, but they were severely deficient both in social nuance and in practical know-how. It was in this context that the cultural cancer arose, a series of insane ideologies which developed in the shell cities before spreading to the wider populace. Each time this occurred, the results were disastrous. I will not describe the individual ideological crises in detail, but I will mention a few of the insane ideologies. There were religions which denied free will or denigrated the spirit of the species as base and immoral. There were messianic collectivist ideologies which promised utopian abundance for all, if only the species was first willing to destroy and rebuild its entire social structure in violent revolution. There was even a cephalopoid fascism, complete with the mystical cult of race and state, which sought, among other things, to create a new form of cannibalism based on social caste. What these cancerous ideologies had in common was emotionally based idealism, loud calls to drastic action, and fundamental inconsistency with reality. The first time a culture was infected with a shell city ideology, the violent crisis that followed was considered a tragic fluke. But after this repeated time and time again, the species realized that some solution must be found. You must understand that the species thought it had evolved beyond warfare, so the reemergence of war on ideological grounds was cause for immense terror, and this terror led to drastic measures. It was determined that when a shell city became culturally infected, it was to be destroyed by force before the infection could spread. However, military action against the shell cities proved far too costly, bombs weren't effective, and it was not acceptable to spend millions of lives taking these fortified cities by force. A method of hydraulic geoengineering was used to sink a city without military action, but this had unforeseen environmental and tectonic consequences, so this solution was also considered unacceptable. The world government, which at this time was a technocratic republic, began a project to develop a weapon which could destroy the shell cities. The weapon looked like an enormous shell nested under layers of electronic instruments. The shell was in fact a chamber in which vast amounts of plasma were to be brought to extreme heat. Because of the special materials used in the chamber shell, the plasma could be heated to intensities comparable to that of a star's interior. Magnetic forces were then used to accelerate the superheated mass towards the target at extreme speeds. Such was the solution to the infected shell cities. The weapon was mounted on a battleship, and was designed so that its firing arc would never permit it to aim at an undersea target. But, as fate would have it, the weapon was never tried against a shell city. The first time the weapon was tested, in order to minimize damage to the environment, it was aimed at the sky. On account of a species of microscopic aeroplankton in the planet's atmosphere, there was an unusually high density of nitrogen and methane. When the mass of superheated plasma passed rapidly through the planet's sky, the atmosphere ignited in a chain reaction, burning off almost completely. The oceans boiled, and without the protection of the atmosphere, all multicellular life died. The cephalopoid lunar colony survived for several months after this tragedy. Ultimately, it degenerated back into cannibalism before starving. Many promising species are destroyed by such tragic flukes. In my opinion, the main factors contributing to this tragedy are as follows. Being an underwater species, the cephalopoids were not disposed to view their own atmosphere as a destructible object, even though, when it came to ocean ecology, they were far more conscientious than humans are. It may be that too much power was vested in the technocratic world government, since it was their ambitious weapons project which ultimately destroyed their civilization. War and dangerous ideologies are the undoing of many species, and there is no easy solution to either of these, since they can only be resolved by the species-wide cultivation of reason in each successive generation. Had it not been for the planet's unusual atmospheric composition, they would have survived this crisis. This final crucial variable, it seems to me, was pure bad luck. The art in this video was generated by the Midjourney AI. It's pretty cool, check it out.